The city was bustling with noise as sirens echoed through the streets. Paramedic Sarah Harper tightened her grip on the steering wheel of the ambulance, her heart pounding. Every second counted. A call had come in just minutes ago. A young child was in critical condition after a terrible accident. Sarah knew that time wasn't on their side. The ambulance sped down Main Street, lights flashing, as her partner, Jake, carefully monitored the little boy in the back. The child's breathing was shallow, and the situation was dire. Sarah's only focus was reaching the hospital as quickly as possible. "Hang in there, buddy," Jake said softly, doing everything he could to stabilize the boy. Sarah could hear the worry in his voice. She pressed her foot harder on the gas, praying they wouldn't hit any traffic. As they approached an intersection, the light turned red. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned on the siren and drove through the light, ensuring the intersection was clear. Other cars had already stopped to let them pass. It was standard for emergency vehicles. But then, flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. A police car sped up behind the ambulance, its siren blaring. Sarah's stomach sank. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. She kept driving, hoping the officer would realize they were on an emergency call and back off. Instead, the police car pulled alongside her. The officer gestured for her to stop. Sarah's frustration grew, but she knew she couldn't ignore him. She quickly pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling as she turned off the engine. The officer, a tall man with a stern face, approached the ambulance. His name tag read Grant. Sarah rolled down the window, already trying to explain. "Officer, we're on an emergency call. There's a critically injured child in the back. We need to get to the hospital immediately." Officer Grant didn't seem to care. His expression remained cold. "You ran a red light," he said firmly. "That's against the law, even for emergency vehicles." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, this is life or death. We have to go." Grant crossed his arms, his tone unyielding. "I need to see your ID and your paperwork. You can't just break traffic laws because you feel like it." Sarah's frustration turned to anger, but she held it back. She didn't have time for this. "Officer, please. The child in the back might not make it if we don't move now." Jake opened the back door of the ambulance and stepped out, his face pale. "We're losing precious time," he said urgently. "This boy needs medical attention immediately." But Officer Grant wasn't budging. He repeated his demand for ID, his voice growing louder. Cars passing by started to slow down, curious about the commotion. Sarah's mind raced. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but every second spent arguing was another second closer to losing the boy. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah could feel her patience wearing thin. All she could do was hope that the officer would see reason before it was too late. The tension outside the ambulance grew thicker by the second. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel as she fought the urge to argue further. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was different. A child's life was at stake, and the clock was ticking. Officer Grant's stance didn't soften. "You're not above the law," he said, his tone firm. "Step out of the vehicle and provide your identification." Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She opened the door and stepped out, her paramedic badge clearly visible on her uniform. "Officer, I understand your concern, but this is an emergency. If we delay even a few more minutes, that boy might not survive." Jake appeared beside her, holding a portable monitor from the ambulance. "Look at this," he said, his voice strained. "The boy's oxygen levels are dropping. We need to move now." Officer Grant glanced at the screen but didn't seem convinced. "I'm not here to debate with you. Procedures exist for a reason. You can't run red lights without following proper protocol." Sarah could feel her frustration bubbling over, but she knew losing her temper wouldn't help. "Officer, there's no time for paperwork or debates. We're asking for your cooperation, not your permission." Traffic on the busy street had slowed to a crawl as passing drivers watched the scene unfold. Some rolled down their windows, whispering to each other or recording the incident on their phones. Sarah felt the weight of all those eyes on her, but her focus remained on the boy in the ambulance. Suddenly, a faint, weak cry came from the back of the ambulance. Sarah's heart sank. The child's condition was worsening. She turned to Officer Grant with desperation in her voice. "Please, let us go. His life depends on this." Grant hesitated, but then his radio crackled. A voice came through, asking for his location and status. He took a step back, clearly torn. Sarah saw a moment of doubt flash across his face. She seized the opportunity. "Think about it," Sarah said, her tone softer now, but no less urgent. "What if it were your child back there? Would you want us to waste time arguing?" For the first time, Grant seemed to pause and consider her words. He looked at the ambulance, then back at Sarah. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, almost defensively. "And we're trying to do ours," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "That boy's life is in our hands, but you're holding us back." Jake leaned closer to Sarah. "We're running out of time," he whispered, glancing anxiously at his watch. The monitor in his hand beeped again, signaling the child's worsening condition. Just as it seemed like Grant might step aside, his stance hardened again. "I can't ignore the law," he said, almost as if convincing himself. "You need to follow the proper process." Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her chest. How could she make him understand? Time was slipping away, and the boy's life hung by a thread. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of the ambulance monitor beeping grew louder in Sarah's mind, matching the quickening pace of her heart. Every moment they stood there felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her. She looked at Jake, who was now visibly pale and sweating. "Sarah," he said quietly, "if we don't move now, it might be too late." Sarah turned to Officer Grant, her voice firm but calm. "Listen, officer, we're not trying to break the law or disrespect your authority. We're just asking for your understanding. This boy's life is slipping away. Please, let us go." But Officer Grant still seemed torn, his eyes darting between Sarah and the ambulance. Just then, a car pulled up beside them. A woman stepped out, holding her phone and looking concerned. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, glancing at the ambulance. Sarah sighed, knowing this would only add to the delay. "Ma'am, we're handling an emergency. Please stay back." The woman didn't move. Instead, she looked at Officer Grant. "Why aren't they going? There's a child in there, right?" Grant stiffened. "This is a legal matter. They ran a red light, and I'm ensuring proper procedures are followed." The woman frowned, clearly not satisfied with his explanation. "I saw the whole thing. They had their sirens on. Isn't that what emergency vehicles are supposed to do? This doesn't make sense." Sarah wanted to thank the woman, but there was no time for pleasantries. She looked at Grant again, her patience wearing thin. "Officer, people are starting to notice. The longer this goes on, the more chaos it's going to cause. Do you want this situation to spiral out of control?" Grant's face tightened, and he opened his mouth to reply. But before he could, Jake shouted from the back of the ambulance. "Sarah, his pulse is dropping." Sarah felt a jolt of fear run through her. She rushed to the back of the ambulance and climbed inside. The little boy's face was pale, his breath shallow. Jake was already working frantically, adjusting the oxygen mask and checking the boy's vitals. "He's crashing," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We need to get him to the hospital now." Sarah's mind raced. She knew they couldn't wait any longer. She stepped back out of the ambulance and faced Officer Grant. Her voice was calm but carried an edge of desperation. "If this boy dies because of this delay, it's on you. Can you live with that?" For a moment, Grant looked shaken. He glanced at the ambulance, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. The weight of the situation seemed to hit him. He stepped back slightly, but he still didn't give a clear answer. Just then, another police car pulled up. A senior officer stepped out, his expression stern. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Sarah wasted no time. "This is an emergency. A child's life is in danger, and we're being delayed." The senior officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at Grant. "Is this true?" Grant hesitated, his face turning red. "I was just trying to follow protocol." The senior officer raised a hand, cutting him off. "Step aside. Now." Relief washed over Sarah as the path cleared. She jumped into the ambulance, started the engine, and sped off toward the hospital, her heart pounding with urgency. The ambulance raced through the city streets, sirens wailing, cutting through traffic like a lifeline. Sarah's hands were steady on the wheel, but her mind raced with worry. In the back, Jake was doing everything he could to keep the boy stable. The delay had cost them precious time, and the boy's condition was worsening with every passing second. "How's he doing?" Sarah called out, her voice strained as she navigated the crowded roads. "Not good," Jake replied, his voice tight with urgency. "His heart rate is dropping. We're losing him, Sarah." Sarah's chest tightened. She pressed harder on the gas, weaving through cars and praying they'd reach the hospital in time. The thought of the boy's parents waiting there, hoping for good news, made her more determined than ever. Minutes felt like hours as they approached the hospital's emergency entrance. A team of doctors and nurses was already waiting outside, alerted by Jake's earlier call. As soon as Sarah brought the ambulance to a halt, the hospital team sprang into action, rushing to the back of the vehicle. "Critical condition," Jake reported as he climbed out, helping to transfer the boy onto a stretcher. "Severe trauma, oxygen levels dropping. He's crashing." The team nodded, quickly wheeling the boy inside. Sarah followed close behind, her heart pounding. She had done her part, but now the child's fate was in the hands of the doctors. Still, the guilt from the delay weighed heavily on her. She couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing him. Inside the hospital, Sarah and Jake stood in the hallway, catching their breath. The adrenaline that had kept them moving was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and worry. Jake slumped against the wall, running a hand through his hair. "That was too close," he muttered. Sarah nodded, her mind replaying the confrontation with Officer Grant. "We should never have been delayed like that. It could have cost that boy his life." As if on cue, the doors to the emergency room swung open, and a woman rushed in, her face pale and full of fear. Sarah recognized her immediately. It was the boy's mother. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she ran toward the nurses, begging for news about her son. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to reassure the mother, but she didn't know what to say. All she could do was hope the doctors could pull the boy through. Moments later, a man entered the hospital. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and walked with purpose. Sarah's breath caught as she realized who he was. Mayor Lisa Carter. The boy wasn't just any child. He was the mayor's son. The mayor scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing on Sarah and Jake. "Are you the paramedics who brought my son in?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Yes," Sarah replied, stepping forward. "We did everything we could." The mayor's expression softened for a moment, but then her face hardened. "And why was there a delay?" "I was told the ambulance was stopped." Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The truth was about to come out, and Sarah could only hope it would lead to the right kind of justice. Sarah took a deep breath as the mayor's piercing eyes locked onto her. The hospital lobby buzzed with activity, but it felt like the world had gone silent for Sarah. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't sure how to explain what had happened without escalating the situation further. "We were stopped," Sarah began carefully, her voice steady but measured. "A police officer pulled us over at an intersection. He insisted we provide identification before letting us go." The mayor's brow furrowed. "You mean to tell me that an officer delayed an ambulance carrying my son during a life-or-death emergency?" Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "We tried to explain the urgency, but he wouldn't listen. I'm sorry for the delay. It wasn't what we wanted." The mayor's lips tightened into a thin line. She turned to Jake, who was leaning against the wall, looking just as drained. "Is this true?" she asked. "Yes," Jake replied, his voice soft but firm. We did everything we could to convince him. It was out of our control. The mayor looked furious, her fists clenching at her sides. Before she could say anything more, a doctor emerged from the emergency room. Mayor Carter, he called, removing his surgical mask. Your son is stable for now, but the situation was critical. Another minute or two, and it could have been much worse. The relief on the mayor's face was palpable, but it quickly turned back to anger as she processed the doctor's words. She turned to her assistant, who was standing nearby. I want a full report on this incident. Get me the name of the officer who stopped that ambulance. Yes, Mom, the assistant said, pulling out her phone and stepping aside to make some calls. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, unsure if she should say anything else. She was glad the boy was stable, but the tension in the room was still thick. The mayor looked at her again, her voice softer this time. Thank you for saving my son, she said. I know you did your best. This wasn't your fault. Sarah nodded, feeling a small wave of relief, but the weight of what had happened still lingered. She knew the fallout from this incident was far from over. A few moments later, a police officer entered the hospital. It wasn't just any officer. It was Officer Grant. He looked uneasy, his usual confidence replaced with hesitation. The mayor spotted him immediately and strode over, her expression cold and unyielding. Are you the officer who stopped that ambulance? She asked, her tone sharp. Grant straightened up, clearly trying to regain his composure. Yes, ma'am, he replied. But I was just following protocol. Protocol? The mayor interrupted, her voice rising slightly. Your protocol nearly cost my son his life. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Grant opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The room seemed to hold its breath as the mayor continued. There will be consequences for this. Mark my words. Sarah watched the exchange, unsure how to feel. She wanted accountability, but she also knew this situation was bigger than just one person. Still, as the mayor's voice rang out, she couldn't help but hope that this would lead to meaningful change. The hospital lobby fell silent after the mayor's sharp words. Officer Grant stood frozen, his face pale. For the first time, his confidence seemed to crack. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The weight of what had happened was finally sinking in. The mayor took a step closer to him, her voice calm but cutting. My son is alive because of those paramedics, not because of your so-called protocol. Do you realize how close you came to causing an unthinkable tragedy? Sarah watched the scene unfold, feeling the mix of emotions. On one hand, she was relieved that the mayor understood the urgency of what had happened. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel sorry for Grant. He looked like a man who had just realized the consequences of his actions. Before the situation could escalate further, the senior officer who had arrived at the scene earlier stepped forward. Mayor Carter, I take full responsibility for addressing this incident, he said, his tone firm but respectful. Officer Grant's actions will be investigated thoroughly. I assure you that steps will be taken to prevent this from happening again. The mayor nodded, but didn't look satisfied. I'll be expecting a full report, she said, and I want to know what kind of training your officers are receiving. If this is what you call following protocol, then something needs to change. The senior officer nodded, his expression grim. Understood, Mom. Officer Grant finally found his voice. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice quieter than anyone had heard before. I thought I was doing the right thing. I never wanted to hurt anyone. The mayor's eyes softened, but only slightly. Intentions don't matter when lives are at stake. What matters is the result. And today, your decision almost cost a child his life. Grant lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. He looked like a man who carried the weight of the world on his back. For the first time, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. Regret. Real, genuine regret. Jake leaned over to Sarah and whispered, Do you think he gets it now? Sarah sighed. I hope so. But it's not just about him. This is bigger than one person. The mayor turned back to Sarah and Jake, her expression softening. I owe you both more than I can say. Thank you for what you did today. You saved my son's life, despite everything that got in your way. Sarah nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. We were just doing our job, ma'am. That's all. The mayor reached out and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. You did more than your job. You went above and beyond. And I promise you, this situation will not be ignored. The tension in the room began to ease, but Sarah knew the events of the day would have lasting effects. Officer Grant's actions had brought a serious issue to light, one that couldn't be ignored any longer. As the mayor and her team left to check on the boy, Sarah and Jake exchanged a tired but knowing look. The boy was safe for now, but the story wasn't over. Changes were coming, and they both hoped it would lead to a better future for everyone. The day after the incident, the city buzzed with news of what had happened. Videos taken by bystanders had gone viral, showing the ambulance stopped by Officer Grant and the tense exchange that followed. Public opinion was swift and unforgiving. Social media exploded with outrage, calling for better training for law enforcement and demanding accountability for the delay. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She hadn't slept much, replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. The boy was safe, and that was what mattered most, but she couldn't shake the lingering frustration. Why had things gone so wrong? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her supervisor, asking her to come to the station for a meeting. Sarah sighed, setting her mug down. She had a feeling this meeting wouldn't just be about paperwork. When she arrived at the paramedic station, Jake was already there, pacing back and forth. He looked up when he saw her. You ready for this? He asked. Not really, Sarah admitted, forcing a small smile. But let's get it over with. Inside the meeting room, their supervisor, Helen, greeted them with a nod. She looked serious, but not upset. First of all, I want to thank both of you for your professionalism yesterday. You handled an incredibly difficult situation with grace and determination. Sarah and Jake exchanged a quick glance, both feeling a bit of relief. Helen continued, that being said, this incident has sparked a lot of attention, more than we've ever seen before. The mayor's office has reached out, and they're planning to launch a joint initiative with the police department to improve communication and protocols between emergency responders and law enforcement. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. That's great news, she said. It's something we've needed for a long time. Helen nodded. It is, but there's more. The mayor wants you both to attend a press conference this afternoon. She plans to speak about what happened and outline the steps being taken to prevent it from happening again. Jake groaned softly. A press conference. Can't we just stay out of the spotlight? Helen smiled faintly. I know it's not ideal, but you two were at the center of this. The public needs to hear your side of the story, and the mayor wants to highlight the importance of what you did. Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. She wasn't a fan of public speaking, but if it meant bringing attention to the issue, she would do it. All right, she said. We'll be there. Later that afternoon, Sarah and Jake stood behind the mayor at the press conference. Cameras flashed, and reporters buzzed with questions. The mayor spoke passionately about the need for change, praising the paramedics for their quick thinking and bravery. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stepped forward, her heart pounding. Yesterday was one of the hardest days of my career, she began. But it reminded me why we do what we do, to save lives. I hope this leads to better understanding and cooperation between all of us who work to protect the public. The crowd applauded, and Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. Change was coming, and she was proud to be part of it. The press conference had been a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah and Jake. By the time they left the stage, both were exhausted but relieved. The mayor had outlined a plan to improve cooperation between emergency services and law enforcement, and Sarah felt hopeful for the first time since the incident. As they walked out of the building, Jake nudged Sarah. You did great up there, he said with a grin. You even got a standing ovation. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. I think that was more for the mayor than for me. But thanks." Their brief moment of levity was interrupted when a voice called out behind them. "Ms. Harper, Mr. Jackson, can I have a moment?" They turned to see a reporter jogging toward them, a notebook in hand. Sarah sighed, glancing at Jake. "Do we really have to?" Jake shrugged. "Might as well get it over with." The reporter introduced herself as Clara, a journalist from a local news station. "I just wanted to thank you both for speaking today," she said. "Your story has really touched a lot of people. I was wondering if you could share more about what was going through your mind during the incident." Sarah hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and she didn't want to say anything that might escalate the situation further. But she also knew this was an opportunity to bring attention to a bigger issue. "I think what was on my mind the most," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully, "was the boy in the back of the ambulance. All I could think about was getting him to the hospital. Everything else, the delay, the confrontation, it all took a backseat to that." Clara nodded, jotting down notes. "And what do you hope will come out of this incident?" Jake stepped in, his tone thoughtful. "I hope it's a wake-up call, not just for law enforcement, but for everyone. We all have a role to play in emergencies, and we need to trust each other to do our jobs." As Clara thanked them and walked away, Sarah felt a sense of relief. She had said her piece, and now it was out of her hands. All she could do was hope that people were listening. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her living room, scrolling through messages on her phone. Friends, family, and even strangers had reached out to thank her for her work and offer words of encouragement. One message, however, caught her eye. It was from Officer Grant. The message was short and sincere. "I'm sorry for what happened. I realize now that I made a mistake, and I hope I can make it right. Thank you for saving that boy's life." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to feel. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she closed her phone and leaned back, thinking about the events of the past few days. The boy was alive. Change was coming. And perhaps, just perhaps, some lessons had been learned. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Sarah woke up to sunlight streaming through her window. It was her first day off after the whirlwind of events, but her mind was still buzzing. As she sipped her coffee, her thoughts kept returning to the boy in the ambulance. Was he doing better? Would his family ever fully recover from such a close call? Before she could let her thoughts spiral, her phone buzzed. It was Jake. "Turn on the news," he said, sounding excited. Sarah grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. A reporter was standing outside the mayor's office, speaking about the city's new emergency response initiative. The screen showed clips from the press conference, including a shot of Sarah and Jake standing behind the mayor. "This initiative," the reporter said, "aims to improve communication and coordination between emergency services and law enforcement, ensuring incidents like yesterday's don't happen again. It's a direct response to the heroic efforts of paramedics Sarah Harper and Jake Jackson, whose quick actions saved the mayor's son." Sarah's cheeks flushed as she heard her name. She hadn't thought of herself as a hero. She had just been doing her job. But hearing it said aloud made her feel proud. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the mayor herself. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know my son is stable and recovering well. I can't thank you enough for what you and Jake did. Your courage and dedication have inspired us to do better. I hope we can meet again under happier circumstances." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of relief. Knowing the boy was okay made all the stress and tension worth it. Later that day, Sarah decided to visit the hospital to check on the boy. When she arrived, she found the mayor in the room, sitting by her son's bed. The boy looked much better. His color had returned, and he was awake, playing with a small stuffed animal. The mayor looked up as Sarah entered. Her face lit up with gratitude. "Sarah, thank you for coming," she said. "I was just telling my son about you." Sarah walked over, feeling a little shy. "How's he doing?" "He's doing great," the mayor said, her voice warm. "Thanks to you." The boy looked up at Sarah with big eyes. "Are you the lady who helped me?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, smiling. "I am. But it wasn't just me. There was a whole team working to make sure you were okay." The boy smiled back, clutching his stuffed animal tightly. "Thank you." The simplicity of his words made Sarah's eyes sting with unshed tears. She reached out and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "You're welcome. Be brave, okay?" As she left the hospital, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The events of the past few days had been challenging, but they had also shown her the strength of teamwork and the importance of speaking up for what's right. And as she looked up at the clear blue sky, Sarah knew that the changes being made would help save more lives in the future. For now, that was all she could hope for.